In 1529, two of the most powerful leaders of the Reformation, Martin Luther and Huldrych Zwingli, met here at Marburg Castle in Germany. They agreed on almost everything: Scripture, salvation, the Trinity, rejection of Rome, and yet they left divided, not over politics or power, but over a single sentence: "This is my body." This was the issue that split the Reformation movement, and today we look at how this moment changed the course of Christianity over the last 500 years. So we're doing just a quick recap on actually the first couple of years of the Reformation. In 1517, Luther put up his thesis on the cathedral door, and of course, that started off the actual Reformation. The students converted it into the German language. Luther, it seems, intended it just to be an academic debate among a few lecturers and students, but the actual students converted it into the German language and spread it around to various different universities in Germany. So the actual Reformation took off a lot faster than he actually could imagine. It was the first instance of actually where Luther sort of lost control of the Reformation, but that was a very minor thing in comparison to what happened later, because over the next couple of years he finds himself in conflict with the Catholic Church in a number of debates. He's had discussions and arguments with various bishops, and over the next 2 years he finds that he's in even deeper conflict, so that by 1520 he writes 3 books in relation to the nobility, in relation to the freedom of the Christian, and in relation to the captivity of the church. And basically what he's saying is he begins to recognize by 1520 that he's not going to be able to bring about the type of internal reform that he hopes for. So he invites the nobility in. And he writes another book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, whereby he actually exposes a lot of corruption. And he's right about that. There is a lot of corruption in the church. But Luther goes further than that. He actually wants to not just tackle the corruption, but also change doctrine in relation to a whole range of areas. For instance, he wants to get rid of 4 of the 7 sacraments. He's somewhat confused at this stage in relation to the sacrament of reconciliation or confession. And that becomes very obvious later, because it causes a lot of different types of conflict. Once you get rid of that, we see that as the doctrine develops into Calvinism in later decades. But actually, in the 1520s, Luther spends a couple of years translating the New Testament in the early 20s. So by 1522, Luther goes back to Germany, and over the next couple of years, he finds the whole theory of Scripture alone actually is creating something of a chaotic situation, because other people as well as him have very strong ideas about, for instance, the Anabaptists. They actually believe that a person is not really a Christian unless they're baptized again. But that has huge implications, because Christianity at this stage is very, very interwoven with the state. And to suggest that everybody needs to be rebaptized again, that means that Martin Luther or the Pope, the bishops, there's nobody really a Christian according to their theory. We're very genuine people, of course, and we're trying to re-establish a pure form of Christianity, but this was actually part of the problem that Luther found in relation to his doctrine of Scripture alone. And the Anabaptists, by this stage, they were actually a real problem. But both Zwingli in Switzerland and Martin Luther in Germany both recognized that they actually needed the state to enforce religion. And of course, there's a tremendous level of persecution of the Anabaptists, because they consider them too radical. And of course, they were attempting. One particular young man was one of the leaders of the Anabaptists. His name is Felix Manx, and he was under 29 years of age actually at the time that he was drowned as a result of his his conviction that actually of the need for rebaptizing everybody. But that movement actually continued on. It became a strong influence in various different strands of Christianity in subsequent centuries. And in actual fact, it thrives best in a situation like America in the present day, where there's freedom of religion. But of course, back in Germany and Switzerland and England, these countries where the actual Reform religion was brought in, it was brought in with actually the control of the state and the influence of the state. And therefore, the Anabaptists in this scenario found themselves, of course, they were also persecuted, in fairness, by both the Catholic Church and these more moderate Reform elements within Christianity. So by the mid-20s, Martin Luther finds himself confronted by some people who are more radical in their ideas than him, have different ideas. For instance, there's Thomas Munster, who actually is leading the Reform agricultural workers and tenant farmers, and he's leading them towards the idea that, based on Luther's writings largely and based on the gospel as well, that they're entitled to a far greater deal, more just society and this type of thing. But that revolution caused the deaths of 70,000 people, and there's another group known, even more radical actually, who are known as Anabaptists. They want to rebaptize everybody. And there's a very tragic case of a young man called Felix Manx, who in 1527 is drowned. He's executed actually on the orders of another great reformer, actually called Huldrych Zwingli in Switzerland. And basically at this stage, by the mid-20s or late 20s, both Zwingli and Luther are aware that the Anabaptists are so radical that they're a threat to the entire movement, and therefore they seek to suppress them. And a lot of Anabaptists are drowned, actually, and they're persecuted, they're punished, they're imprisoned. Thousands of people are imprisoned and forced to leave their territories and this type of thing, with the result that the Anabaptists by the late 20s are basically suppressed. And therefore, towards the later part of the 20s, 27, 28, the Reformation movement was split in three, but it has been reduced to two strands at this stage. One led by Martin Luther himself in Germany, which is more moderate. Luther is looking for limited reforms, but Zwingli is operating from Switzerland, and he is a more radical reformer, another great theologian, and he wants to actually use the state in a far more positive manner, a far more definite manner than actually Martin Luther, and in terms of enforcing reforms. And of course that happens in several countries where people are forced to actually adopt the new religion, in the sense that people didn't have a personal choice on that. But as the 90s develop, Martin Luther becomes aware that he is promoting a different type of theology to Zwingli, because especially in regard to the Eucharist, Martin Luther, by about 26, 27, he's reading some of these leaflets that has been produced in Switzerland by Zwingli, and he recognizes that there's a considerable difference between him and Zwingli, and also between him and, of course, the Anabaptists. And he refers to these people as Luther is very, as I said there, Luther is very direct in his language. He calls these people who are more radical than himself fanatics, and a lot of other words as well, which are very blunt, actually, very direct, but that's the type of man he is. And by the late 20s, the Reform movement has split into two streams, basically, and the actual Prince of Hesse, Prince Philip, he recognizes that there's need for unity. So he brings these two great reformers together at his own castle in Marburg in 1529. This is probably the most important meeting of the entire Reformation movement, at least for the first couple of decades. And here they attempt to hammer out a 15-point program that they would agree on, and they agree on actually 14 points of it. in relation to the nature of Christ, the Trinity, the various different doctrines of the Creed, etc. But when it comes to the actual Eucharist, they find themselves in total disagreement. And Luther wouldn't have been too surprised at this scenario, because he had read these leaflets coming from Switzerland years earlier. And he wouldn't have been shocked at the idea like that Zwingli considered the Eucharist simply symbolic, that it's just bread. Whereas Luther had a completely different understanding of that, in that Luther was an Augustinian scholar. He had read the great theologian Augustine, and he was aware that Augustine had, his writings indicated that Christians believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist going right back to the apostles. So he wasn't prepared to budge on this issue. The two men fell out on this, and as a result of that, of course, Zwingli went back to Switzerland, recognizing that he couldn't get any help from Germany. There was no possibility of support from outside. And his idea was to enforce his particular theology onto the entire Swiss nation. For him, that was important in order to have a unified country, because Switzerland is a confederation which is dependent. These various provinces, or what's called cantons, are dependent on various different understandings, military alliances, trade deals, etc., that have gone back decades, in some cases back centuries. And Zwingli attempts to impose this reform doctrine onto the entire country. But as a result of that, of course, that's another story. I'll deal with that in the next video if you'd like to subscribe. Zwingli goes back to Switzerland. He recognizes that the reform movement is basically split into two. And indeed, actually, even to this day, there continues to be the more moderate Lutheran Church and the reform movement. And of course, Zwingli gets killed in 31. He's quite a young man, actually. He's about the same age as Luther at this stage. And he gets killed in battle in 1531. And John Calvin in the following years, of course, takes up where he leaves off and develops the reform movement further. That's for a future video if you'd like to subscribe to that. That's it for today, and thank you very much for watching, and goodbye for now.